The key in Michael's hand looked like a decision made by someone else. He slid it into the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. Klaus did not step forward. He watched the corners first, then the window, then the space behind the door, trying to prove to his body that the room was not a trap. The result was that the offer of a room arrived as a threat, and the cost was that Michael's simple kindness turned into a problem he now had to manage. Michael said, in plain English, that this was Klaus's room and that he could set it up however he wanted. Klaus nodded once because nodding was cheaper than speaking. He kept his feet on the threshold, as if crossing it would sign something he could not read. The result was a pause that felt like refusal, and the cost was that ownership landed on Klaus as pressure rather than relief. Klaus had slept in places where bodies were counted like inventory and where blankets were shared on rotation. He had learned to keep his elbows tight, his voice low, and his possessions smaller than envy. Now he was being told there was space that belonged only to him, and his mind reached for the familiar question, what will it cost later? The result was that he interpreted generosity as a delayed charge, and the cost was that he could not give Michael the reaction Michael expected. Michael stepped inside first, pulled the curtain to show there was a window, and patted the bed to show it held weight. Klaus followed a step behind, touching the wall with his fingertips and then his palm, testing whether the surface held warmth. It was smooth, sealed and new, with no marks he could interpret. The result was that the room gave him no history to read, and the cost was that he could not use his old skill, measuring danger by damage, to decide how to breathe. He walked the perimeter once, counting steps from bed to door, from door to window, from window back to bed. He stopped at the door and looked at the hinge and latch as if they were weapons. The result was that the room became a map rather than a home, and the cost was that mapping kept him in survival mode when he needed rest. Michael asked what Klaus wanted on the desk: books, a lamp, paper, and Klaus shook his head. Every object offered would become an object to guard. The result was that he refused useful things, and the cost was that he increased the room's emptiness and the pressure the emptiness created. He sat on the bed's edge and listened to how the room returned small sounds to him. In crowded places he could hide in noise, but here every shift of fabric felt recorded. The result was a sharp awareness of his own body, and the cost was that the room made him feel exposed even when no one else was watching. Michael lingered in the doorway, asked if Klaus needed anything, and then left. Klaus heard another set of footsteps stop in the hall. An older boy, Otto, leaned where he could see the new key and the new door. He said softly that having your own room meant people knew exactly where to find you. The result was that the room's promise was poisoned before it could settle, and the cost was that Klaus began to treat the walls as a target marker instead of protection. Klaus shut the door and tested the latch, then stopped himself from turning the key. Locking it would mean admitting he expected an attack. Leaving it unlocked would mean admitting one could happen. The result was a two-sided fear that had no safe option, and the cost was that he could not even choose a door position without losing something. He dragged the chair from the desk toward the door and set it with its back to the knob, not as a barricade that would stop someone, but as a warning that someone had tried. Then he moved it back again because he imagined Michael seeing it and asking questions. The result was that he rehearsed defense and then erased it, and the cost was that he felt foolish either way, too paranoid to relax, too controlled to protect himself. His suitcase sat on the floor as his only familiar object. He knelt, opened it, and stared at what little he owned: clothes, a small wooden horse, and a smooth stone worn by his thumb. He did not reach in at first, because placing these things in a clean room would make the past visible. The result was hesitation that stretched into silence, and the cost was that the room stayed empty in a way that accused him. He took the wooden horse and set it on the window ledge, facing outward as if it could watch for him. He took the stone and placed it beside the bed where his hand could find it without searching. He folded his clothes and pushed them deep into the wardrobe, hiding them as if he were still a guest. The result was a room with 3 small claims of his presence, and the cost was that each claim could be broken, stolen, or used to prove something about him. He tried another way to make the room obey him. He placed the suitcase at the foot of the bed as if it were a boundary line, then stepped over it and back again, testing whether ritual could replace comfort. The result was a sense of command measured in inches, and the cost was that command depended on repetition, which meant the room would never simply be safe. He experimented with the door the way he experimented with everything else. He left it slightly open to let hallway sound in, then flinched when a distant laugh reached him and closed it again, ashamed of the flinch. The result was a first lesson that privacy and isolation were not the same thing, and the cost was that he could not yet choose the balance without panic. Before supper, he tried to practice a few English words Michael had used: room, yours, safe, whispering them into the empty air. The words sounded wrong in his mouth, too clean, as if they belonged to someone with a steady past. The result was that language felt like another room he could not enter, and the cost was that he stayed trapped inside silence when he needed help. He stood over the desk and tried to imagine writing his name on a clean sheet of paper, the way children did in school, the way people marked what belonged to them. He imagined the paper being found, the name becoming evidence that he had become arrogant enough to believe in belonging. The result was that he did not write, and the cost was that he denied himself a simple act that might have made the room real. He tried the mattress twice, lying down, sitting up, until he learned how it responded. The bed held him, but the act of testing felt mechanical, like preparing equipment rather than resting. The result was control without comfort, and the cost was that he was already planning for failure. Hunger pushed him out of thought. In late afternoon, a neighbor, Mrs. Liu, knocked once and held out a small bag. Michael translated. "Welcome, food." Inside were 2 oranges and a bun. Klaus took the bag with both hands and bowed because he had no words. The result was that kindness arrived without conditions he could see, and the cost was that accepting it made him feel indebted and weak. He carried the oranges to the desk and stared at their color as if it were suspicious. He peeled one slowly and ate it standing, ready to move if needed, and he saved a strip of peel in his palm because the smell felt like proof of a world that had not been burned. Then he threw it away, afraid of wanting it. The result was that he tasted safety and rejected it in the same motion, and the cost was a small grief he could not explain. Downstairs, Michael called him to supper. Klaus followed because staying alone in the room felt like inviting danger, and because he could not refuse too many invitations without drawing attention. At the table, he ate quickly, eyes moving, listening for changes in tone, and watching how Michael moved without scanning the room. The result was that Klaus took in food and routine, and the cost was that routine made him fear what would happen when it was interrupted. When he returned upstairs, Otto's laughter sounded behind a door and then stopped abruptly, as if cut off on purpose. Klaus paused on the landing, waiting for the next sound, and then forced himself to keep walking. The result was that he chose not to chase provocation, and the cost was that he carried the tension into his room like a hidden object. At night, Michael said goodnight and closed the door. Klaus looked at the bed, the horse, the stone, and the latch, and he tried to believe the room was simply a place to sleep. The result was that he could not make himself believe it, and the cost was that the first night began as an ordeal, not a rest. The latch clicked, and Klaus's body reacted as if the click were an alarm. He kept his shoes on, lay stiffly, and listened. At first there was only the building settling and the thin hum of electric power. Then came distant voices, a door closing below, the bell of a streetcar, and a foghorn from the bay. The result was a stream of unfamiliar signals, and the cost was that his mind treated each one as a warning he was too late to understand. He tried to count breaths until the numbers blurred. He got up and pressed his ear to the door, hearing nothing but his own pulse, and he hated the pulse because it proved he was alive and therefore vulnerable. The result was uncertainty instead of proof, and the cost was that uncertainty exhausted him faster than a known threat. He checked the window latch once and the wardrobe once, forcing himself to stop after that, so he would not begin a ritual he could never satisfy. Then he stood in the center of the room and listened again, as if the room owed him an explanation. The result was that he imposed rules on himself, and the cost was that rules created more ways to fail. He turned on the bedside lamp to chase the dark, then found the lamp made shadows that looked wrong. The wooden horse's shadow stretched and bent, and his tired brain turned the distortion into a creature leaning toward him. The result was a new fear replacing the old one, and the cost was that he could not find a stable state. Darkness was dangerous, light was dangerous, and the choice itself became torture. He pulled the blanket over his head to hide from the shapes, then felt trapped by his own hiding and tore it back down. He sat up, lay down, sat up again, and each movement creaked the bed and made him imagine someone outside the door taking notes. The result was restless motion without escape, and the cost was a growing shame that he could not do the simple thing a child was supposed to do: sleep. His hand went to the stone. He held it, imagining what it could do if the door opened. The fantasy gave him a hard, sharp calm that frightened him more than the foghorn did, because it felt like the calm before breaking someone. He set the stone down as if it were burning and forced his fingers open. The result was a refusal to let violence become his first tool here, and the cost was that he had nothing else that felt strong enough. He dozed in fragments and woke at small sounds. In one wakeful jerk he heard German shouting in his head, and then realized it was only street voices he could not translate. He lay very still and tried to separate memory from the present by naming objects: bed, desk, door, lamp. The result was that he stayed anchored for seconds at a time, and the cost was that anchoring required constant effort, leaving nothing for rest. When daylight finally came, he felt no victory. His mouth was dry, his shoulders hurt from holding themselves high, and the room looked unchanged, as if it had not noticed his struggle. The result was that surviving the night did not build trust, and the cost was dread of repeating the same fight. He went downstairs early, so he would not be alone with the room. He ate quickly, then returned upstairs as soon as he could, because being watched while he ate made him feel like a guest who could be uninvited. The result was a small reduction of panic through motion, and the cost was that motion became another avoidance habit. He tried to use the room the way Michael expected. He sat at the desk and opened a book Michael had left there, then realized he could not absorb words while his ears were scanning. He stood, took 2 steps, sat again, and finally closed the book without reading a page. The result was proof that the room existed but not yet for him, and the cost was frustration that turned inward. Otto stopped him in the hallway that afternoon and asked with a flat smile how the rich man liked sleeping alone. Klaus did not answer. Otto said that quiet rooms broke people and that Klaus should not give anyone a reason to complain. The result was a reminder that the room was visible to others as a privilege, and the cost was that Klaus felt resentment aimed in 2 directions, at Otto for naming it and at himself for wanting it. Klaus avoided Otto after that by timing his trips to the stairs, but avoidance made Otto's presence larger in his mind. Each time Klaus heard footsteps pause near his door, he wondered whether Otto was listening for weakness. The result was a new layer of paranoia focused on one person, and the cost was that Otto began to occupy the room even when absent. That evening, a woman named Mrs. Kaplan came to the building and spoke with Michael. Michael called Klaus down and translated, "Neighbors sleep early, don't disturb them. Adjustment is being watched." Mrs. Kaplan smiled in a careful way that did not invite questions, and her eyes moved over Klaus as if he were an entry on a form. The result was that the threat of removal became official, and the cost was that asking for help now felt like producing evidence against himself. The next afternoon, Otto passed his door and tapped the wood twice with 1 knuckle, not loud enough to be a complaint, loud enough to be heard. Klaus froze on the bed, waiting for a 3rd tap that never came. The result was that Otto proved he could reach Klaus without entering, and the cost was that Klaus began to dread even harmless sounds as deliberate tests. Klaus tried to remove Otto from his mind by giving himself tasks. He cleaned the desk surface with a damp cloth, folded his clothes again, and rearranged the horse on the sill so it faced a different angle, as if changing small objects could change the night. The result was movement that looked like settling in, and the cost was that the tasks were only camouflage over the same fear. He also began to ration himself without being asked. He drank less water in the evening so he would not need the hallway bathroom at night, and he ate less at supper so his stomach would not wake him. The result was fewer reasons to leave the room after dark, and the cost was that he punished himself to avoid a danger that had not yet happened. Klaus tried to prepare the second night like a plan. He left the lamp angled, shoes near the bed, stone within reach but not in hand, and he promised himself he would not touch the door unless the knob turned. The result was a structure he could follow, and the cost was that structure turned him into a guard on his own life. For a while the ritual held. Then slow footsteps paused outside his door. Nothing turned the knob, nothing spoke, but the pause was enough. Klaus sat up and held his breath until his lungs hurt and the bed creaked under him like an accusation. The result was that his fear found a shape, and the cost was that the shape pushed him toward rage. He moved to the door and listened. The footsteps drifted away. He pictured Otto in the hall, pictured Mrs. Kaplan writing notes, pictured himself opening the door and making the kind of noise that would end his placement. The result was that he stayed silent, and the cost was that silence forced the anger inward until it hurt. He attempted a compromise. He opened the window a hand's width so outside air could enter, believing that air movement would make the room less sealed. The air did not calm him. It made him listen harder for distant sounds, multiplying what his mind could misread. The result was a failed solution that created new triggers, and the cost was deeper exhaustion. By the third day, his hands shook when he held a cup. Michael asked if he was all right. Klaus said yes, because he did not know how to say the truth without risking everything. Michael accepted the lie and offered tea, then added, still gently, that if Klaus needed anything at night, he could knock. The result was an open invitation, and the cost was that an invitation is only useful if you can bear to use it. That night, Klaus tried to rehearse the knock in his head, the way he rehearsed escape routes. He imagined stepping into the hall and being seen, imagined Otto hearing, imagined Mrs. Kaplan's polite consequences. The result was that the idea of asking for help became another threat to manage, and the cost was that he entered the night already defeated. On the fourth night, a loud argument flared downstairs and ended with a door slam that shook the building. Klaus sat up instantly. His hand grabbed the stone without permission from his mind. The result was readiness to hurt someone who was not even in his room, and the cost was the realization that he was close to becoming dangerous in a place that demanded he be quiet. The hallway quieted again, but Klaus did not. He stared at the stone in his palm and set it down with care, as if care could erase the impulse. The foghorn sounded, and instead of fading into background, it seemed to fill the room with endless breath. The result was fear without a target, and the cost was a despair that had no enemy he could strike. He tried to lie down. Images came, ruins, buried bodies, hands reaching, and his body responded as if the floor were collapsing. He pressed his nails into his palm to anchor himself with pain, and then stopped because the pain was becoming a habit. The result was a few seconds of control, and the cost was the understanding that his old methods were turning into new injuries. He stood and paced from bed to door and back, listening to his own breathing as if it belonged to a stranger. The room reflected him back to himself with nothing to interrupt it, and the reflection made him feel exposed. The result was that loneliness became physical, and the cost was that he began to believe he would not survive another night by force of will alone. He considered leaving the room and sleeping on the hallway floor where other people might pass, trading privacy for noise and witness. He pictured Mrs. Kaplan seeing him there in the morning and calling it instability. The result was that he rejected an obvious escape, and the cost was that he trapped himself back inside the four walls. He looked at the door and pictured what was on the other side. Michael awake or asleep. A voice, a human presence. He also pictured rejection and humiliation and the official consequence of being labeled trouble. The result was a choice between two fears, and the cost was that either choice required surrender, surrender of pride, or surrender of control. A simple sentence formed in him. If the door stays closed, he will not make it. He did not mean death as drama. He meant the slow collapse that would end with him running, shouting, breaking something, or hurting himself. He walked to the door on bare feet that felt the cold boards under him, and each small creak sounded like exposure. The result was movement toward help, and the cost was terror at being seen. He lifted his hand, held it there, and imagined all the ways this could go wrong. Then he lowered it, stepped back and tried again to breathe through it, as if endurance were the point of the test. The room offered no reward for endurance, only more minutes. The result was that delay proved useless, and the cost was that he wasted the last of his strength. He raised his hand again and knocked 3 times, as lightly as he could. The sound was small, but final. The result was that he made his need audible, and the cost was that silence afterward would be a verdict. The door across the hall opened almost at once. Michael stood there with a book in his hand, awake and alert. He asked what was wrong. Klaus's mouth opened and closed, and nothing came out. The result was that he failed to explain himself, and the cost was a sudden fear that his silence would be read as manipulation or madness. Michael did not rush forward. He shifted sideways, leaving space in the doorway, and said Klaus could come in and sit for a while. He did not touch Klaus and did not press for a story. The result was permission without interrogation, and the cost was that Klaus felt his eyes burn with a relief he did not want to show. Klaus crossed the hall and entered Michael's room. It felt lived in. Papers, a folded map, a cup that smelled faintly of tea. Michael sat on his bed, opened the book again, and let Klaus choose where to sit. The result was a space without demands, and the cost was that Klaus had to admit how much he needed that. Minutes passed in which Michael read and turned pages and said a few low sentences about what he was reading without requiring a response. Klaus listened to the pages the way he listened to a safe crowd, proof that time was passing without a threat approaching. The result was that his breathing slowed, and the cost was that calm arrived only when another person carried part of it. The foghorn sounded again, but it no longer dominated. It was just one sound among others. Klaus realized his fear had been enlarged by isolation more than by the noise itself. The result was a new understanding of the problem, and the cost was a new responsibility. If isolation was the trigger, he could not solve it alone. After a while, Klaus stood. He managed a quiet good night in German. Michael nodded as if it was enough, and before Klaus left, pointed at Klaus's door and then at his own, a simple gesture that meant, "You can do this again." The result was a path offered without words, and the cost was that Klaus now had to accept repetition, trust built in small, repeated acts rather than one dramatic change. In his room, he faced the door and chose not to seal it. He closed it but did not turn the key, leaving it latched but not locked. A thin line of light showed under the door, and from across the hall came the steady whisper of pages. The result was a compromise, privacy without isolation, and the cost was vulnerability he could not eliminate, only manage. He placed the stone in the wardrobe and shut the door, not to remove danger from the world, but to remove it from easy reach. The result was a deliberate reduction of temptation, and the cost was the fear that without the stone he might be helpless if a real threat came. Klaus lay down and waited for the old images. Some arrived, faint and stubborn, but the light under the door and the soft page sounds kept the present from dissolving. The result was sleep deeper than he had managed since arriving, and the cost was trust given in small amounts to someone outside the 4 walls. Before sleep took him, Klaus made one more rule for himself. If he woke in panic, he would sit up first, listen for the page sound, and only then decide whether to cross the hall. The result was a plan that did not require heroism, and the cost was that he accepted the problem would return, and that returning was not failure. The following evening, he tested the plan in advance. He went to Michael's door before fear arrived, knocked once, and handed over the stone without explanation. Michael took it, looked at Klaus's face, and placed the stone in his own drawer, as if it were ordinary. The result was that Klaus moved a piece of danger out of his room voluntarily, and the cost was that he admitted, without words, that he could not trust himself alone with it on bad nights. In the morning, the wooden horse on the sill looked like a toy again, not a warning. Klaus opened the door and let ordinary noise enter, and he went downstairs without waiting for an invitation. The result was a fragile routine beginning to form, and the cost was that routine meant he now had something to lose, which was both the risk and the point.